They thought renting a frozen forest cabin for $300 a month would save them from homelessness. But when 72-year-old Margaret and 75-year-old Thomas broke into the abandoned mansion next door to survive a deadly blizzard, they discovered it wasn't abandoned at all. And the $270 million secret hidden inside would change everything they thought they knew about loss, survival, and why some places wait decades for exactly the right people to arrive. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The notice came on a Tuesday. Margaret Anderson held the thin white paper in her trembling hands, reading the words over and over, as if repetition might change their meaning. 30 days to vacate. The letters blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough over the past 2 years, enough for a lifetime. She stood in the tiny kitchen of their apartment in Whitefish, Montana, the morning light cutting through the curtains and illuminating dust motes that danced like they had nowhere better to be. The coffee maker sputtered its last drops into the pot. Thomas was still asleep in the bedroom, or at least pretending to be. He'd been doing that more lately, staying in bed longer, moving slower, like the weight of their situation had settled into his bones. Margaret folded the eviction notice carefully and placed it on the counter next to the stack of medical bills. She didn't need to add them up again. She knew the number by heart. $147,612.18. That's what surviving cancer cost when you were 72 years old, with insurance that covered just enough to keep you breathing, but not enough to keep you whole. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. November in Montana meant early snow, and it had already started to gather in the corners of the parking lot. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman she barely recognized anymore. Thin, her hair gone silver white, her face carved with lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She used to be a schoolteacher, 38 years of shaping young minds, of early mornings and parent-teacher conferences, and the quiet satisfaction of watching children learn to read. Now she was just another old woman who couldn't afford to live. Thomas shuffled into the kitchen, his slippers making soft sounds against the linoleum. He was 75, tall but stooped now, his ranger uniform long retired and replaced with flannel shirts and worn jeans. His hands, once strong enough to hoist a backpack and hike 20 miles through mountain terrain, now shook slightly as he poured his coffee. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Margaret didn't turn from the window. "We got the final notice." The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas set his mug down carefully, the ceramic meeting the counter with a soft click. He walked over and stood beside her, his hand finding hers. His palm was warm and calloused and familiar. "How long?" he asked. 30 days. He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this. Maybe he had. They'd been 2 months behind on rent, then 3, then 4. The landlord had been patient, more patient than he needed to be, but patience only stretched so far when you had bills of your own to pay. "The kids," Thomas started. "No," Margaret said firmly. "We're not asking the kids." Their 3 children were scattered across the country like seeds thrown to the wind. David in Seattle, working 60-hour weeks at a tech company, underwater on his mortgage and student loans. Sarah in Florida, a single mother of 2, barely keeping her head above water teaching middle school. And James, sweet James, who'd moved to Boston for a job that paid well, but left him hollow-eyed and exhausted every time they video-called. They'd raised good children, hard-working children, children who would drop everything to help if they asked, and that was exactly why Margaret refused to ask. "We'll figure something out," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret squeezed his hand. "We always do." But this time, she wasn't sure. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a fog of phone calls and dead ends. Margaret spent hours on the computer at the public library, searching for apartments they could afford on their combined Social Security checks. $1,800 a month. That's what they had to work with. In Whitefish, where tourism had driven rent prices through the roof, that might cover a studio apartment if they were lucky. Maybe. But luck hadn't been on their side for a while now. Thomas took on the role of the optimist, which was new for him. He'd always been the practical one, the planner, the man who prepared for every contingency during his 32 years as a park ranger. But now he smiled when Margaret looked defeated. He made jokes when the silence got too heavy. He held her at night when she thought he was asleep and whispered that everything would be okay. She wanted to believe him. On a Friday morning, 17 days before they had to leave, Thomas came home from the library with a printout clutched in his hand. His eyes had a spark in them that Margaret hadn't seen in months. "I found something," he said, spreading the paper on their kitchen table. Margaret set down the box she'd been packing, dishes they'd owned for 40 years, each one a memory, and leaned over to look. It was a rental listing, crude, barely formatted, with a single grainy photo of a small wooden cabin surrounded by snow-covered pine trees. The text was minimal: remote caretaker's cabin available for long-term rent, $300 per month, utilities included, Bitterroot mountain range, accessible by snowmobile during winter months. Must be comfortable with extreme isolation. Serious inquiries only. Margaret read it 3 times. $300? "I know it sounds too good to be true," Thomas said quickly, "but I called the number, spoke to a lawyer named Harrison. He says it's legitimate. The property belongs to an estate that's been in legal limbo for decades. They need someone to occupy the caretaker's cabin, keep an eye on things. The main house is sealed, but the cabin is fully functional." "Extreme isolation," Margaret read aloud. "What does that mean exactly?" Thomas shifted his weight. "It means we'd be about 40 miles from the nearest town. The road is only accessible by snowmobile once the heavy snow hits, which is any day now. We'd need to stock up on supplies, be self-sufficient for weeks at a time." Margaret looked at her husband, really looked at him. She saw the hope in his eyes fighting with the fear. This was a man who'd spent his entire career in the wilderness, who knew how to survive in conditions that would kill most people. But he was also 75 years old, and she was 72, and neither of them was as strong as they used to be. "How would we even get there?" she asked. "Harrison said he'd arrange transport for us and our belongings, one time. After that, we'd be on our own until spring thaw, unless we had our own snowmobile." "Do we have our own snowmobile?" Thomas almost smiled. "No." Margaret sat down heavily in one of their kitchen chairs. $300 a month. They could afford that. They could afford food, basic supplies, maybe even save a little. But the isolation, being cut off from the world for months at a time, that was terrifying. What if one of them got sick? What if they needed help? What if they didn't have any other choice? She looked around their small apartment. The walls were bare now, pictures already packed away. The furniture was second-hand, worn but loved. This place had been their home for 6 years, ever since they'd downsized from the house where they'd raised their children. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and in 17 days it wouldn't be. "Call him back," Margaret said quietly. "Tell him we'll take it." Thomas exhaled, relief washing over his face. He pulled Margaret into a hug, and she let herself lean into him, drawing strength from the steady beat of his heart. "We're going to be okay," he whispered into her hair. Margaret closed her eyes. I know. She didn't know, but she needed to believe. The next 12 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Thomas made lists, endless lists, of everything they'd need. Food that wouldn't spoil, batteries, flashlights, warm clothes, medical supplies, firewood, tools. Margaret went through their belongings with ruthless efficiency, dividing everything into 3 categories: essential, sentimental, and leave behind. The hardest part was telling the children. David called first, his voice crackling over the phone connection. "Mum, this is insane. You can't just disappear into the mountains in the middle of winter." "We're not disappearing," Margaret said calmly. We're renting a place we can afford. Then let me help. I can send money. David, no. You have your own life, your own bills. We're not your responsibility. You're my mother, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Of course you're my responsibility. Margaret's throat tightened. Sweetheart, this is what we want. Your father knows these mountains better than anyone. We'll be fine. They had similar conversations with Sarah and James. Sarah cried. James got angry. Both offered money they didn't really have, and Margaret refused them both with as much grace as she could muster. She didn't tell them about the medical bills. She didn't tell them that without those bills, they wouldn't be in this situation. She didn't tell them that sometimes love means protecting your children from your problems, even when they're grown. On the morning they were supposed to leave, Margaret stood in their empty apartment one last time. The walls looked smaller without their pictures. The rooms echoed without furniture. It felt like a shell, a place that had once held life but was now hollow. Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Ready? She nodded, not trusting her voice. The lawyer, Harrison, arrived in a four-wheel drive truck with a trailer attached. He was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 45, with the kind of practiced smile that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. He shook their hands and helped load their boxes with efficient movements. It's a 3-hour drive to the access point, Harrison explained as they climbed into the truck. From there, we'll transfer everything to the snowmobile and sled. The cabin is another hour past that. Margaret watched Whitefish disappear in the side mirror, the town where she'd taught second grade for 15 years, the town where she'd gone to chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 months, the town that had become too expensive for people like her and Thomas to exist in. They drove east into the mountains, the roads becoming narrower and more treacherous with each mile. Snow had started to fall, light at first, then heavier. Thomas sat in the front seat with Harrison, the two men talking about wildlife and weather patterns, ranger talk that Margaret had heard for decades. She let their voices wash over her and watched the landscape transform into something wild and untouched. The access point turned out to be a small, cleared area where the paved road ended. A snowmobile sat waiting, along with a large sled for cargo. Harrison began transferring their belongings with methodical precision, fitting boxes and bags like a puzzle. "You'll want to hold on tight," he said to Margaret as he helped her onto the back of the snowmobile. "The trail gets rough." Rough was an understatement. They flew through the forest, snow spraying up around them, trees whipping past in a blur of white and green. Margaret clutched Thomas's waist and pressed her face against his back, trusting him to keep them steady. The cold bit through her layers, sharp and unforgiving. After what felt like both forever and no time at all, they emerged into a clearing. Margaret's first thought was how small it looked. The caretaker's cabin sat in the center of the clearing, a simple structure with weathered wood siding and a stone chimney. It was maybe 600 square feet, one story with a small covered porch. Smoke should have been curling from the chimney, but there was none. The windows were dark, and behind it, maybe 200 yards away through the trees, loomed something else entirely. A mansion. It was partially hidden by the forest, but what Margaret could see took her breath away. Stone walls, tall windows, multiple stories rising into the grey sky. Even from this distance, even shrouded in snow and shadow, it radiated a kind of faded grandeur that didn't belong in these mountains. Harrison killed the snowmobile engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. "The cabin's all yours," he said, gesturing to the small structure. "Let me show you around." He unlocked the door. The key was old, brass, worn smooth with age, and led them inside. The interior was sparse but functional. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchenette, a table with 2 chairs. A door led to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a sink. Another door opened to a bedroom barely large enough for a double bed. "Water comes from a well," Harrison explained, pointing to the hand pump by the sink. Wood stove is your heat and cooking. There's a propane generator in the shed out back for emergencies, but I'd save it for when you really need it. Propane delivery doesn't happen until spring. Thomas was already inspecting the stove, checking the flue, testing the door. Margaret stood in the center of the room and tried to imagine living here. Tried to picture months of being contained in this small space with nothing but snow and silence outside. "And the main house?" Thomas asked, nodding toward the windows that faced the mansion. Harrison's expression shifted, became more formal. "The estate is sealed, has been for 40 years. You're not to enter under any circumstances. Your job is simply to occupy the caretaker's cabin, keep it maintained, and report any issues to my office." 40 years, Margaret said. Why? The owner, Vincent Harlow, disappeared in 1983. No body was ever found. No heirs came forward. The estate's been in legal limbo ever since. My firm manages it. "Manages it how?" Thomas asked. "If no one's been here in 40 years, "Automated systems," Harrison said quickly. "Security, basic maintenance. It's all handled remotely. Your concern is the cabin, not the house." Something about the way he said it made Margaret uneasy. But before she could ask more questions, Harrison was pulling papers from his briefcase. "Lease agreement," he said, spreading them on the small table. "Month to month, $300 due on the 1st. My contact information is here. Cell service is non-existent this far out, but there's a landline that works most of the time." He pointed to an old rotary phone mounted on the wall. "Any questions?" Margaret had 1,000 questions. Why was this place so cheap? What happened to Vincent Harlow? Why had no one lived here in 4 decades? But she looked at Thomas, saw the worry lines around his eyes, thought about the eviction notice and the medical bills and the choices they didn't have. "Where do we sign?" she asked. Harrison left as the afternoon sun began to slip behind the mountains. They watched him disappear into the trees, the sound of the snowmobile fading until there was nothing but wind and the soft whisper of falling snow. Thomas and Margaret stood on the small porch of the cabin, surrounded by their boxes and bags, and looked at what would be their home. "Well," Thomas said, putting his arm around her shoulders, "we've had worse." Margaret laughed, despite herself. "Have we? Remember that camping trip in Yellowstone, 1978, when it rained for 6 days straight and the tent flooded? We were 40 years younger. We were also 40 years dumber," Thomas said, kissing the top of her head. "Come on, let's get settled before dark." They worked together as they always had, moving boxes inside, organizing their few possessions into the limited space. Thomas got the wood stove going, and soon warmth began to fill the small room. Margaret unpacked their dishes, finding places for them in the tiny kitchenette. The familiarity of the objects, the blue coffee mugs they'd gotten as a wedding gift, the cast-iron skillet Thomas's mother had given them, the chipped plate that had survived 3 moves and 5 grandchildren, made the space feel less foreign. As night fell, they sat at the small table eating soup Margaret had heated on the wood stove. Through the window, they could see the mansion in the distance. Lights should have been off, the place dark and dead, but as Margaret watched, she could have sworn she saw something. A flicker in one of the upper windows, gone so fast she couldn't be sure it was real. "Thomas," she said quietly, "did you see?" But when she looked again, there was nothing. Just darkness and snow and the skeletal outline of a house that had been waiting for 40 years. "Probably just reflection from our fire," Thomas said, but he was staring at the mansion too. They didn't talk about it again. Instead, they finished their soup, washed their dishes in water from the hand pump, and prepared for bed. The mattress was old but serviceable. Margaret piled every blanket they owned on top of it, and they crawled underneath, pressing close together for warmth. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow began to fall harder, the flakes visible in the light from their window. Margaret listened to Thomas's breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep, but she stayed awake, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. Somewhere in the darkness, the mansion waited. Empty, Harrison had said. Sealed for 40 years. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that empty wasn't quite the right word. The house didn't feel empty. It felt patient, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly these people. She pulled the blankets tighter and closed her eyes, telling herself it was just exhaustion, just stress, just the strangeness of a new place. But deep down, in that part of her that had survived cancer and medical bills and the slow erosion of everything she'd built, Margaret knew the truth. Their story in this place was just beginning, and the mansion in the snow held secrets that would change everything. The first week in the cabin taught Margaret and Thomas what survival actually meant. It wasn't the romantic notion of living off the land that Thomas had experienced as a young ranger. It wasn't the adventure they might have embraced in their 40s or 50s. It was waking up at 5 in the morning because the fire had died and the temperature inside had dropped to 40 degrees. It was pumping water from the well until your arms ached. It was rationing food because you didn't know when you'd get to town again. But it was also something else, something Margaret hadn't expected. It was quiet in a way the world had forgotten how to be. No traffic sounds, no neighbors' television through thin walls, no constant buzz of electricity and human noise. Just wind through pine trees, the occasional crack of a branch heavy with snow, and the sound of their own breathing. Thomas thrived in it. Margaret watched him transform over those first days, saw the years fall away from his shoulders. He woke early each morning, bundled up in layers, and went outside to check their supplies, chop wood, clear snow from the paths he was creating around the cabin. His hands remembered the work, and his body followed. Margaret found her own rhythm. She organized their small space with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing a classroom. Every item had a place. Every task had a time. She cooked on the wood stove, learning to judge temperature by the heat against her palm. She read by the light of their propane lamp, working through the stack of books she'd brought from their old life. And every day, several times a day, her eyes were drawn to the mansion. It sat in the clearing beyond the trees like a sleeping giant. Harrison had called it sealed, abandoned, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them. Several times she saw what looked like lights in the windows, quick flashes that disappeared before she could point them out to Thomas. Once she could have sworn she heard music drifting through the trees, something classical and faint. "You're imagining things," Thomas said gently when she mentioned it. "Old houses settle, metal contracts in the cold, makes all kinds of sounds." But he'd started looking at the mansion more often too. On their 9th day in the cabin, Margaret discovered the garden. She'd been exploring the area close to their cabin, staying within sight of the small structure, as Thomas had insisted when she found them. Raised beds, maybe 20 of them, arranged in neat rows behind a snow-covered fence. They should have been buried, dead, forgotten under 2 feet of snow. Instead, they were green. Margaret brushed snow away from the nearest bed and gasped. Vegetables grew there, healthy and vibrant. Tomatoes heavy on the vine, lettuce in perfect rows, herbs she recognized from her own garden decades ago, basil, thyme, rosemary. In November, in Montana, under snow. She stood up quickly, her heart racing. The beds were warm to the touch, not hot, but warmer than they should be. She could feel heat rising from the soil even through her gloves. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice sharp. He came running, axe still in hand, eyes scanning for danger. She pointed at the garden beds. Thomas knelt down, examined the plants with the careful attention he'd once given to trail signs. He dug his fingers into the soil and held them there for a long moment. "Heated from below," he said quietly. "There's a system running underneath, professional grade." "For a caretaker's cabin?" "No," Thomas said, standing and looking toward the mansion. "For that." They both turned to stare at the house. Its windows reflected the gray sky, giving nothing away. Harrison said the estate had automated systems, Margaret said, for security and basic maintenance. Basic maintenance doesn't include heated garden beds that nobody's been tending for 40 years, Thomas replied. Someone's been here, or someone's controlling all this remotely. Why wouldn't Harrison tell us? Thomas shook his head. I don't know, but I'm starting to think there's a lot Harrison didn't tell us. That night, they harvested vegetables from the garden, fresh food they hadn't paid for, hadn't planted, that shouldn't exist. Margaret made a salad that tasted like summer, and they ate it in silence, both of them aware that they were living in the middle of something they didn't understand. The temperature began to drop on their 14th day. Thomas noticed it first, the way he noticed everything about weather and wilderness. The wind had shifted, coming from the north now, sharp and relentless. The sky took on a particular quality, a heavy grayness that spoke of serious snow. We're going to get hit, he said, standing on the porch and studying the clouds. Soon, maybe tonight. They spent the afternoon preparing. Thomas brought in extra firewood, stacking it against every available wall inside the cabin. Margaret filled every container they had with water from the pump. They moved their emergency supplies closer, made sure the propane generator in the shed was accessible. The snow started just after dark. At first it was gentle, almost pretty, fat flakes drifting down like in a children's book. Margaret stood at the window watching them accumulate, thinking about the students she used to teach, how they'd press their faces against the classroom windows on the first snow day. By midnight, gentle had become violent. The wind howled around the cabin like something alive and angry. Snow fell so thick Margaret couldn't see the trees 20 feet away. It piled against the door, against the windows, covering the porch in drifts that climbed higher with each passing hour. Thomas fed the fire constantly, keeping it roaring against the cold that pressed in from all sides. They didn't sleep, just sat together wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage. By morning, the world had disappeared. Thomas forced the door open, had to throw his shoulder against it 3 times before the snow gave way enough for him to squeeze through. Margaret heard him outside, heard the sound of the shovel against snow that had already drifted waist-high. He came back in covered in white, his face red from the wind. I've never seen it come down this fast. We've got at least 3 feet, and it's still falling. The firewood, we're okay for today, maybe tomorrow, but if this keeps up... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The storm lasted 3 days, 72 hours of wind and snow and cold that seeped through every crack in the cabin walls. They burned through their indoor firewood supply. Thomas made trips to the shed, each one taking longer as the drifts grew deeper. Margaret watched him struggle through snow that reached his chest, her heart in her throat every time he disappeared into the white. On the 3rd night, the wood stove started making a sound it shouldn't make. A rattling, choking sound that sent Thomas to his knees in front of it, flashlight in hand. The flue's blocked, he said, his voice tight. Ice or debris, I can't clear it from inside. What does that mean? It means we can't keep burning. The smoke has nowhere to go. Margaret understood immediately. No fire meant no heat. And outside, the temperature had dropped to -30 degrees. They let the fire die. Within an hour, the cold began to creep in. They piled on every piece of clothing they owned, huddled together under every blanket. But it wasn't enough. Margaret's teeth chattered. Her fingers went numb even inside her gloves. Thomas wrapped himself around her, trying to share body heat, but she could feel him shivering too. The generator, Margaret said through chattering teeth, in the shed. Won't heat the whole cabin, and we need to save the propane. They sat in the darkness as the cold grew teeth. Margaret's thoughts started to slow, to drift. She recognized the signs of hypothermia from the safety courses she'd taken years ago. The drowsiness, the confusion, the way Thomas's shivering had stopped, which was worse than when it was happening. "Thomas," she whispered, We have to do something." He didn't answer at first. Then slowly he said, "The house." Harrison said, "Harrison isn't here. We are. And if we stay in this cabin, we'll be dead by morning." Margaret knew he was right. She'd known it for the past hour, but had been too scared to say it. They'd been given one rule: don't enter the main house. But rules didn't matter when your choice was between breaking them and dying. "Help me up," she said. They bundled themselves in every warm thing they owned. Thomas grabbed the flashlight and the pry bar he'd been using to clear ice. Margaret took the emergency pack. They stepped out into the night. The cold hit like a physical blow. The wind had finally stopped, but the temperature was deadly. Margaret's lungs burned with each breath. The snow came up to her thighs, and each step was a battle. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and massive against the star-filled sky. Thomas led the way, breaking trail, and Margaret followed in his footsteps. It felt like miles, even though it was maybe 200 yards. By the time they reached the side door, a servant's entrance, Thomas guessed, Margaret couldn't feel her feet. Thomas wedged the pry bar into the doorframe and pulled. The wood was old but solid. He tried again, putting his weight into it, and something cracked. The door swung inward. Warm air rushed out, not just the absence of cold, but actual warmth. Heat that made Margaret's frozen face sting. They stood in the doorway, staring into the darkness beyond, neither of them quite believing what they were feeling. Thomas stepped inside first. Margaret followed, and the moment she crossed the threshold, she knew Harrison had lied to them. The house wasn't sealed. It wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Thomas found a light switch and flipped it. Nothing happened. He tried another. Still nothing. But as their eyes adjusted, they realized they didn't need electric lights. The house had its own illumination, soft, ambient, coming from sources Margaret couldn't identify. Enough to see by, enough to know they weren't in a dead building. They stood in what appeared to be a mudroom, marble floors unmarred by dust. Coat hooks on the wall, empty but polished. A bench with cushions that looked freshly cleaned. And warmth. Blessed, impossible warmth. "This isn't right," Thomas whispered. "Harrison said 40 years. Harrison lied," Margaret finished. They moved deeper into the house, staying close together. The mudroom opened into a kitchen that made Margaret's breath catch. It was enormous, easily 5 times the size of their entire cabin. Commercial-grade appliances lined the walls. A massive island dominated the center, its marble top gleaming. Copper pots hung from racks overhead, catching the strange ambient light. Thomas touched the refrigerator. "It's running." Margaret opened it. Inside, the shelves were empty but clean, the light bright, the temperature perfect. "Thomas," she said slowly, "if no one's been here for 40 years, why is the refrigerator plugged in and running?" He didn't answer. They both knew there was no good explanation. They explored further, moving through rooms that grew increasingly grand. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20. A parlor with furniture arranged as if waiting for guests. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. Every surface was clean, every piece of furniture was positioned with care. The air smelled faintly of lemon and wood polish. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. In the center of the main hallway, a grand staircase curved upward to the second floor. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, dark but pristine. The banister was carved from dark wood, smooth and perfect under Margaret's hand. "This is insane," Thomas said. "This level of preservation, the climate control, the power. Someone's been maintaining this place, actively maintaining it." "But who?" Margaret asked. "And why hide it?" They found the study on the second floor. It was smaller than the other rooms, more intimate. A massive desk sat before a wall of windows that looked out over the snow-covered forest. Bookshelves lined the other walls. A leather chair, worn but cared for, sat behind the desk. And on the desk, arranged in neat stacks, were papers. Thomas approached them slowly, like they might bite. He picked up the first stack and flipped through it. His eyes widened. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Journals. Dated entries going back decades." He read aloud. "December 15th, 1982. The gardens are thriving despite the cold. The heating system I designed works even better than projected. I've created something sustainable here, something that could last beyond me." He grabbed another stack. "March 3rd, 1983. I know they think I'm crazy, my colleagues, the few friends I had left. But wealth means nothing if it's not used to create something meaningful. This house, these systems, they're my legacy. But to whom?" Margaret felt cold despite the warmth of the room. "These are Vincent Harlow's journals, the man who disappeared." Thomas nodded, already reading the next entry. His face had gone pale. "What?" Margaret pressed. "What does it say?" Thomas looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something between wonder and fear. "He didn't disappear. He planned all of this. Listen, June 7th, 1983, my final entry. Tomorrow I leave this place for the last time. My health is failing, and the doctors give me weeks, perhaps days. But the house will endure. I've programmed the systems to run indefinitely. Solar power, geothermal heating, automated maintenance. Everything needed to preserve this place until the right people arrive." "The right people?" Margaret whispered. Thomas continued reading. "I've instructed my lawyers to rent the caretaker's cabin at a rate that only the truly desperate would accept. Those who have nowhere else to go. Those who understand what it means to lose everything. Because only people who have lost can truly appreciate what it means to find something worth keeping." Margaret sat down hard in the leather chair. Her mind raced. He built all of this knowing he'd die, knowing strangers would eventually come. "Not strangers," Thomas said, still reading. "Listen, they will arrive with nothing. They will struggle and wonder and fear, and on a night when they have no other choice, when the cold forces their hand, they will break my one rule and enter the house. And when they do, they will discover what I've left for them." Margaret's hands trembled. "Left for them? Left for us?" Thomas set down the journal and looked around the study with new eyes. "He's talking about a will, about inheritance, about—" He stopped mid-sentence. "About what?" "About tests," Thomas said slowly. He wanted to find people who were desperate enough to take the cabin, but resourceful enough to survive. Strong enough to break the rules when rules became death sentences. He was looking for survivors. Margaret stood and walked to the windows. Below she could see their small cabin, dark and cold, smoke no longer rising from its chimney. They'd been living there for 2 weeks, struggling, surviving, making do with almost nothing while this house, this palace, sat 200 yards away, warm and waiting. "Why?" she asked. "Why go through all this? If he wanted to leave his estate to someone, there are normal ways to do that." "Because normal ways attract the wrong people," a voice said from behind them. Margaret and Thomas spun around. A man stood in the doorway. Not Harrison. Someone older, maybe 60, in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the wilderness. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm sorry to startle you. My name is James Thornton. I'm the senior partner at the firm that manages the Harlow estate. Harrison called me when he noticed unusual activity in the house systems, motion sensors, heat signatures. I drove through the storm to get here." "You knew," Margaret said, her voice hard. "You knew the house was like this, and you let us freeze in that cabin." Thornton stepped into the room carefully. "I knew what Vincent Harlow designed. What I didn't know was whether it would work, whether anyone would actually pass his tests." "Tests?" Thomas's voice was dangerous. "We almost died out there." "You chose to come here," Thornton said gently. "Desperate, yes, with limited options. But you chose this over asking your children for help. You chose independence over easy comfort. That was the first test. Then you survived 2 weeks in that cabin with minimal supplies. You learned to be self-sufficient. That was the second test. And tonight? Margaret asked. Tonight you broke the one rule you were given because the alternative was death. You chose survival over obedience. That was the final test. Thornton walked to the desk and picked up a leather folder Margaret hadn't noticed. Vincent Harlow died in August of 1983. He left explicit instructions. The estate, all of it, would be held in trust until someone passed his 3 tests. At that point, it would transfer to them completely. The room spun. Margaret reached for the desk to steady herself. Transfer, she managed. You mean the house, the land, the systems, everything, including the financial assets held in trust, currently valued at approximately $270 million. Thomas made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. That's insane. We rented a cabin. We're just 2 old people trying to survive the winter. Exactly, Thornton said. That's exactly what Vincent wanted. He had no children, no family. His colleagues were wealthy men who saw his inventions as profit centers. His friends were people who tolerated his eccentricities because of his money. He died alone in a hospital bed, and his last coherent thought was that his life's work, his wealth, his legacy should go to people who actually needed it. People who would appreciate it. People who had nothing. Margaret found her voice. This can't be legal. You can't just give an estate to random people who rent a cabin. Vincent's will was very specific, very detailed, and yes, it was challenged. For 40 years, distant relatives and fortune hunters tried to break it. They all failed. The courts upheld his wishes. The tests had to be passed, and until tonight, no one had passed them all. He opened the leather folder and removed a document. This is the deed to the property. As of the moment you entered this house, it became yours. The money transfers tomorrow morning. There are conditions, of course, requirements for how you use the estate. But the core fact remains. You're no longer renters. You're the owners of the Harlow estate. Margaret looked at Thomas. His face was the color of snow. She imagined she looked the same. Why us? She whispered. Out of everyone in 40 years, why did we end up here? Thornton smiled. Harrison has been placing that advertisement every winter for 4 decades. Thousands of people saw it. Hundreds called. Dozens came to look. But they all walked away when they realized how isolated it was, how hard life would be. Only you were desperate enough to stay. Only you were strong enough to survive. And only you were brave enough to break the rules when breaking them became necessary. He set the deed on the desk. Vincent Harlow spent his life creating sustainable systems. He believed technology should serve human needs, not profit margins. This house runs on solar and geothermal power. It produces its own food. It's completely self-sufficient. And he wanted it to belong to people who understood the value of such things, people who had been failed by the system and knew what it meant to have nothing. Thomas picked up the deed with shaking hands. Their names were already written on it. Margaret and Thomas Anderson, owners of record. The date was today's date. How long have you known? Thomas asked quietly. I've been monitoring you since you arrived, Thornton admitted. Cameras, sensors. I watched you adapt to the cabin, watched you discover the gardens, watched Thomas chop wood and Margaret organize your supplies. Vincent's instructions were clear. I had to wait for you to enter the house of your own accord. No one could tell you. No one could help you. You had to choose survival. Margaret's mind was reeling. The medical bills. We have $147,000 in medical debt. That's why we're here. That's why we couldn't afford. It's paid, Thornton said. As of this morning, the trust paid every debt you have, both of you. Student loans from your children's education that you co-signed. The second mortgage you took out to help Sarah after her divorce. All of it. Gone. Thomas sat down heavily. I don't understand. Vincent Harlow made his fortune designing sustainable energy systems. He held over 300 patents. Companies still pay licensing fees. The money kept accumulating after his death, managed by the trust. $270 million, all waiting for the people who would need it most. Thornton moved toward the door. I'll leave you to process this. There's food in the kitchen, properly stocked as of this afternoon. The house is yours to explore. Tomorrow morning, I'll return with the full documentation. You'll meet with financial advisors, lawyers, all the people you need to understand what this means. He paused at the doorway. Vincent left a final letter. It's in the safe behind the painting above the desk. The combination is the date you arrived here. He couldn't have known what that date would be, but he programmed the system to update automatically when someone passed all 3 tests. He wanted you to read it first, before any lawyers or advisors, before the world comes rushing in. Then he was gone. Margaret and Thomas sat in silence for a long time. Outside, snow continued to fall on a world that had changed completely in the space of a single night. Finally, Thomas stood and walked to the painting Thornton had indicated. It was a landscape, beautiful but unremarkable. He swung it aside, revealing a wall safe. November 14th. The day they arrived. He entered the numbers. The safe clicked open. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age but preserved carefully. Thomas removed it and brought it back to the desk. Margaret joined him, and together they opened it. The handwriting was shaky but legible. To whoever you are, if you're reading this, then you've passed my tests. You came to my home with nothing. You survived with less. And when death came knocking, you chose to live, even if it meant breaking rules. I admire that. I designed those tests not to torture you, but to ensure that my life's work went to people who understood its value. People who had been beaten down by circumstance, but refused to stay beaten. You are those people. This house, this land, this fortune, it's yours now. But it comes with a responsibility. Vincent Harlow. Margaret didn't sleep that first night in the Harlow mansion. She and Thomas had found a bedroom on the 2nd floor, a guest room with a 4-poster bed that looked like something from a museum. The sheets were fresh, the mattress firm, and the temperature was perfect. After 2 weeks of huddling under threadbare blankets in a freezing cabin, it should have felt like heaven. Instead, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. $270 million. She kept repeating the number, trying to make it feel real. It was more money than she could conceptualize. More than her entire extended family would earn in 10 lifetimes. More than the GDP of small countries. And it was theirs. Beside her, Thomas was equally awake. She could tell by his breathing, shallow and irregular instead of the deep rhythm of sleep. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? She whispered into the darkness. That this is insane and we should probably call someone? That we're in way over our heads and have no idea what we're doing? Thomas rolled onto his side to face her. In the ambient light from the windows, she could see the worry lines etched deep around his eyes. Both, he admitted, plus about 100 other things. Margaret reached for his hand. The medical bills are paid. Thornton said all our debts are gone. I know. We could leave. Right now. We could call Harrison, tell him we don't want any of this, and just walk away. We'd still be free of the debt. We could find a small apartment somewhere, live simply. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you want? Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. They'd spent their entire lives working hard, playing by the rules, doing the right thing. And where had it gotten them? Evicted from an apartment they could no longer afford, forced into isolation, nearly frozen to death in a cabin that cost $300 a month. But this felt like cheating. like they'd won a lottery they never entered. "I don't know what I want," she said honestly. "I keep thinking about Vincent Harlow. Why would someone with this much money die alone? Why go through all this trouble to give it away to strangers?" "Maybe he was lonely," Thomas said. "Maybe he realized too late that money doesn't buy the things that actually matter." "Or maybe he was crazy," Margaret countered. "Maybe this whole thing is some elaborate joke, and tomorrow lawyers are going to show up and tell us there's been a mistake." Thomas squeezed her hand. Thornton seemed pretty certain. Thornton could be lying. Why would he lie? Margaret didn't have an answer for that. She rolled onto her back again, staring at the ornate plaster medallion on the ceiling. Somewhere in this enormous house, there were answers. Vincent Harlow's journals, his plans, the full truth of what he'd created and why. But did she want to know, or would knowing make this harder? "Let's sleep on it," Thomas said. "In the morning we'll think more clearly." But Margaret knew she wouldn't sleep, and she was right. Dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through curtains that had probably cost more than their old furniture combined. Margaret gave up on sleep around 5 and wandered downstairs in the clothes she'd been wearing for 2 days straight. Her boots left faint prints on the marble floor. The kitchen was even more impressive in daylight. Massive windows looked out over the snow-covered forest. The appliances gleamed. Margaret opened the refrigerator and found it fully stocked. Fresh vegetables, milk, eggs, cheese, items that had definitely not been there 40 years ago. Thornton had said it was stocked yesterday afternoon, which meant people had been coming and going from this house regularly, probably for decades, while Harrison told prospective renters it was sealed and abandoned. She made coffee in a machine that probably cost more than a used car and sat at the enormous island feeling very small. That's when she noticed the binder. It sat on the counter near the stove, leather-bound and thick. The label on the spine read, "House Operations Manual." Margaret pulled it toward her and flipped it open. The first page was an index, sections on solar power systems, geothermal heating, water purification, garden automation, security protocols. Hundreds of pages of technical documentation. She flipped to a section at random and found herself reading about the garden beds she'd discovered. The system was brilliantly designed. Geothermal heat pipes ran beneath the soil, controlled by sensors that adjusted temperature based on weather and plant needs. The whole thing was automated, self-maintaining, designed to run indefinitely without human intervention. Vincent Harlow hadn't just been wealthy, he'd been a genius. Margaret spent the next 2 hours reading, losing herself in the intricate systems that kept the house running. Solar panels on the roof captured energy and stored it in battery arrays in the basement. Geothermal wells tapped into the Earth's heat. Rainwater was collected, filtered, and purified. Waste was composted. The entire estate was a closed loop, sustainable and independent. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Margaret jumped. Thomas stood in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep. "I've been reading about the systems," she said. "Thomas, this house could survive the apocalypse. It doesn't need anything from the outside world. Power, water, food, it's all self-generated." Thomas poured himself coffee and sat beside her. That was the point, I think. Vincent wanted to prove it was possible, that technology could make people independent instead of dependent. But why hide it? Why not share this with the world? Maybe he tried. Maybe the world wasn't interested. Thomas flipped through the binder. Or maybe he realized that people with money would use this technology to get richer, and people without money would never have access to it. So he decided to give it to people who needed it most. Margaret closed the binder. "Us." "Us," Thomas agreed. They sat in silence, drinking coffee as morning light filled the kitchen. Outside, fresh snow covered the landscape, pristine and untouched. "The kids are going to call soon," Margaret said. "They call every Sunday morning." Thomas nodded. "What are we going to tell them?" "I don't know. The truth sounds insane." "So does lying. Margaret's phone, still connected through the house's mysterious cell signal system, rang right on schedule at 8 o'clock. David's name flashed on the screen. She answered with a cheerfulness she didn't quite feel. "Good morning, sweetheart." "Mom, are you okay? I've been worried sick. That storm that went through Montana was all over the news." "We're fine," Margaret said, looking around the massive kitchen. We've been staying warm." "Is the cabin holding up? Do you have enough firewood?" Margaret felt Thomas's eyes on her. She should tell David the truth, that they weren't in the cabin anymore, that they'd inherited a mansion and a fortune, that every problem they'd had was solved. But the words stuck in her throat. "We're managing," she said instead. "How are you? How's work?" They talked for 20 minutes about David's life, his stress, his mortgage, the promotion he'd been passed over for. Margaret listened and made supportive sounds and felt the weight of her deception growing heavier with each minute. When they hung up, Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Managing?" "I couldn't tell him," Margaret said. "Not yet. Not until we understand what this all means." Similar conversations happened with Sarah and James, half-truths and omissions. Margaret justified it by telling herself she was protecting them, but she knew the real truth. She was scared. Scared that if she said it out loud, it would vanish. Scared that someone would realize a mistake had been made. Scared that she didn't deserve this. Thornton returned at 10 o'clock, driving a 4-wheel drive SUV that somehow navigated the snow-choked forest roads. He wasn't alone. 3 other people climbed out with him, 2 men and a woman, all carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of professional neutrality. "Financial advisor, estate lawyer, and tax specialist," Thornton explained as they gathered around the dining room table. "We have a lot to cover." The next 4 hours were a blur of documents and explanations. Margaret's head spun with terms she barely understood. Trusts and annuities and investment portfolios, tax implications and charitable foundations and legal structures. The financial advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, laid out the numbers. The estate's current liquid assets total $273,400,000. This includes the original trust, 40 years of accumulated licensing fees from Vincent Harlow's patents, and conservative investments. The property itself, the house, land, equipment, and infrastructure, is valued separately at approximately $47 million. Margaret felt dizzy. Thomas had gone pale. Patricia continued. "Vincent's will includes specific requirements. You must maintain the estate's systems. You must live here at least 6 months per year, and you must use a portion of the wealth, at least 10% annually, for what he called meaningful purposes. Charitable work, community improvement, helping others in need. 10% of $270 million, Thomas calculated slowly. That's $27 million a year we have to give away. Minimum, the estate lawyer confirmed. Vincent was very specific. He didn't want his money hoarded. He wanted it used to help people. Margaret found her voice. What if we can't? What if we don't know how to manage that much money, that much responsibility? Thornton smiled gently. That's why we're here. You won't be doing this alone. The trust has staff, advisors, people who've been managing Vincent's assets for decades. They'll help you, but the final decisions are yours. They signed papers, dozens of them. Margaret's hand cramped from writing her name so many times. With each signature, the reality became more solid, more undeniable. This was happening. This was real. By the time the lawyers left, it was late afternoon. Margaret and Thomas stood at the front windows, watching the vehicles disappear into the trees. We own a $300 million estate, Thomas said flatly, and we're supposed to give away $27 million a year to help people. Yes. We don't know how to do that. No. We're in way over our heads. Completely. They looked at each other and, despite everything, started to laugh. It was the kind of laughter that bordered on hysteria, the kind that came from stress and disbelief and the sheer absurdity of their situation. When they finally caught their breath, Margaret wiped her eyes. Well, we'd better figure it out. Over the next week, they began to settle into the house, not as caretakers or visitors, but as owners. It felt strange, almost transgressive, to use the beautiful things Vincent had left behind. Margaret found herself apologizing to furniture when she sat on it. But slowly, room by room, they explored. The library became Thomas's favorite space. Thousands of books lined the shelves, classics, technical manuals, philosophy, history. He'd pull one down at random and settle into the leather chair by the window, reading for hours. Margaret gravitated toward the music room. A grand piano sat in the corner, polished to a mirror shine. She hadn't played in years, not since they'd sold their upright to pay bills. But her fingers remembered. She started with simple pieces, then gradually worked up to the Beethoven and Chopin she'd loved as a young woman. They found more of Vincent's journals scattered throughout the house. Thomas collected them, organizing them chronologically, and they read them together in the evenings. The picture that emerged was of a brilliant, lonely man. Vincent had been orphaned young, raised by a wealthy uncle who saw his genius as a commodity. He'd made his first million by 25 with a patent for improved solar cell efficiency. By 40, he'd amassed a fortune designing sustainable energy systems. But he'd never married, never had children. His journal entries grew more melancholic as the years passed. September 19, 1978, Thomas read aloud. Another gala, another room full of people who only see dollar signs when they look at me. I've accumulated wealth beyond measure, but I've lost something essential along the way. Human connection, purpose beyond profit. I'm 50 years old, and I've never done anything that truly mattered. The later entries detailed his terminal cancer diagnosis and his decision to create the estate as a test. I want to find people who understand what it means to have nothing, Vincent had written. People who've been knocked down by life but refuse to stay down. They're the only ones who'll appreciate what I've built, the only ones who'll use it the way it should be used. Margaret set down the journal she'd been reading. He was so lonely. He was also incredibly strategic, Thomas said. Look at how carefully he designed all this. The tests weren't random. They were specifically crafted to filter out everyone except people exactly like us. Desperate people. Survivors, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. Margaret stood and walked to the windows. Outside, the gardens were thriving despite feet of snow. Inside, she was warm and safe and surrounded by more wealth than she could comprehend. And yet, something felt wrong. I feel guilty, she admitted. About what? About having this when so many people have nothing. About living in luxury while our children struggle with debt and long hours. About not earning it. Thomas joined her at the window. Vincent would say you did earn it. By surviving. By not giving up. Surviving isn't a skill, it's just stubborn refusal to die. Sometimes that's enough, Thomas said quietly. The call came on their 16th day in the mansion. Margaret answered the phone without checking the caller ID, expecting one of the kids. Instead, Harrison's voice crackled through the line. Mrs. Anderson, I need to speak with you and your husband, immediately. Something in his tone made Margaret's stomach clench. About what? About the estate. I'm coming up tomorrow morning. We have issues to discuss. He hung up before Margaret could respond. Harrison arrived with two men Margaret didn't recognize. They wore expensive suits and carried briefcases, and everything about their body language screamed hostility. Thornton arrived 30 minutes later, looking grim. They gathered in the study, the same room where Margaret and Thomas had first read Vincent's letter. Harrison sat behind the desk like he owned it, which immediately raised Margaret's hackles. There's been a complication, Harrison began without preamble. Vincent Harlow's will is being contested. Margaret's heart sank. By whom? Distant relatives. a nephew twice removed who's come forward claiming he should have been notified of Vincent's death. He's arguing that the will is invalid, that Vincent wasn't in his right mind when he created these elaborate tests. Vincent was perfectly lucid, Thornton interjected. We have medical records, psychiatric evaluations. Nevertheless, Harrison interrupted, the challenge has been filed, which means the estate is frozen until the courts can resolve the matter. Thomas leaned forward. What does that mean for us? One of Harrison's companions, a thin man with cold eyes, spoke up. It means you need to vacate the property immediately. Until ownership is determined, you're trespassing. That's absurd, Margaret said. We passed Vincent's tests. We have documentation. Documentation that's now under legal scrutiny, Harrison said smoothly. I'm sure you understand. This is a complicated situation. Best to let the lawyers sort it out while you return to more appropriate accommodations. Something in the way he said it made Margaret's skin crawl. She looked at Thornton, who had gone very still. Harrison, Thornton said carefully, you're supposed to be managing this estate in accordance with Vincent's wishes, not actively working against them. Harrison smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. I'm protecting the estate from what could be a massive legal liability. These people show up, spend a few weeks in a cabin, and suddenly they're entitled to $300 million. You have to see how that looks. It looks exactly like what Vincent designed, Thornton shot back. You've known about his will for 40 years. You've been placing those rental ads every winter specifically to find people who would pass his tests. And now that someone finally has, you're trying to take it away from them? I'm doing my job, Harrison said coldly. Margaret felt something shift inside her. Fear turned to anger, hot and bright. No, she said, her voice steady. You're not. You're trying to steal something that doesn't belong to you. Harrison stood abruptly. I'll give you 24 hours to pack your belongings and leave. After that, I'll have you removed. On what authority? Thomas demanded. On the authority of the firm that's managed this estate for 4 decades. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. After they left, Margaret and Thomas sat in stunned silence. Thornton paced the study, his face flushed with anger. This is my fault, he said. I should have anticipated Harrison would pull something like this. He's been embezzling from the estate for years. Margaret's head snapped up. What? Small amounts. 100,000 here, 200,000 there, spread over decades, hidden in administrative costs and property maintenance. I've suspected for years, but I could never prove it. Vincent's will was so complex, it gave Harrison broad discretionary powers. Thornton stopped pacing. But now that the estate is actually transferring to new owners, now that there'll be audits and scrutiny, Harrison's scared. If you take ownership, his theft gets exposed. So he's trying to block the transfer, Thomas said slowly, by having the will contested. Exactly. And I'd bet my career that distant nephew is either fictional or being paid by Harrison to file the challenge. Margaret stood and walked to Vincent's desk. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, thinking about the man who'd sat here, dying of cancer, carefully crafting a plan to help strangers he'd never meet. We're not leaving, she said quietly. Thomas looked at her. Margaret. No. Vincent designed this place for people who'd been knocked down, people who had nothing, people who refused to give up. She turned to face them. That's us. We didn't ask for this, but we're here. And I'll be damned if I let some corrupt lawyer steal it because he's scared of getting caught. Thornton smiled slowly. You want to fight? I want to win, Margaret corrected. What do we need to do? We need proof of Harrison's embezzlement. We need to expose the fake nephew, and we need to make this story public before Harrison can bury it in legal proceedings. Thomas stood. Then let's get to work. They spent the next 3 days searching the estate, every file, every document, every record going back 40 years. Margaret worked through Vincent's journals, looking for references to financial discrepancies, Thomas focused on the operational records, comparing Harrison's reported expenses to actual work done. Thornton brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet woman named Chen, who had a gift for finding hidden money. On the fourth day, Chen emerged from the basement office they'd set up, holding a stack of printouts. "Got him," she said simply. They gathered around as she spread the documents on the table. Harrison's been billing the estate for property maintenance that never happened. Security system upgrades using equipment that was never installed, consulting fees for firms that don't exist. Over the past 20 years, he's siphoned off approximately $11 million. Margaret felt cold. 11 million? Give or take a few $100,000. He was smart about it, but not smart enough. Once I knew what to look for, the pattern was clear. "What about the nephew?" Thomas asked. Thornton pulled up his phone. "I hired an investigator. Turns out Harrison's distant relative is actually a third cousin who lives in Nevada, unemployed, drowning in gambling debt. Harrison approached him 6 months ago with an offer. File the legal challenge, and he'd receive $500,000. 6 months ago, Margaret said, before we even arrived. Harrison's been planning this for a while, Thornton confirmed. He probably scouts every potential renter, ready to block them if they look like they might actually pass Vincent's tests. Margaret felt her anger crystallize into determination. Then we go public. We expose all of it. That's risky, Thornton warned. Once this story gets out, you'll have media attention, curiosity seekers, people questioning whether you deserve this. Do we deserve it? Margaret asked. Really? Thornton met her eyes. Vincent thought so, and after watching you these past weeks, I think so too. You could have walked away a dozen times. You could have taken the money and run. Instead, you're fighting for what Vincent wanted, fighting to protect his legacy. That's exactly what he hoped for. Margaret looked at Thomas. He nodded. Make the call, she said. The story broke 48 hours later. Local news first, then regional, then national. Elderly couple inherits $300 million estate after passing mysterious tests. Corrupt lawyer exposed in embezzlement scheme. The narrative was compelling, and the media ran with it. Margaret and Thomas gave one interview to a sympathetic reporter from the Associated Press. They sat in the library, surrounded by Vincent's books, and told their story simply. The eviction, the medical bills, the desperate choice to rent a cabin in the wilderness, the discovery of the mansion, Vincent's vision. We didn't ask for this, Margaret said on camera, but we're going to honor Vincent Harlow's wishes. This wealth was meant to help people. That's what we intend to do. The public response was overwhelming. Social media exploded with support. People shared their own stories of medical debt, eviction, desperation. Vincent Harlow's name trended on Twitter. His old patents were dug up and analyzed. Technologists praised his sustainable designs, and Harrison's embezzlement became a national scandal. Within a week, he was arrested. The fake nephew confession detailed their arrangement. The courts fast-tracked the will validation process. Margaret and Thomas sat in the study, watching news coverage of Harrison being led away in handcuffs. Vincent would have loved this, Thomas said. Margaret nodded. Poetic justice. The man who tried to steal his legacy brought down by the very systems Vincent designed to prevent exactly that. Thornton called that evening. The judge ruled in your favor. Harrison's challenge is dismissed. The will stands. As of tomorrow morning, the estate is officially, legally, irrevocably yours. Margaret felt something release in her chest. Relief, but also something heavier. Responsibility. Thank you, she said, for believing in us, for fighting for us. I was fighting for Vincent, Thornton said. But you made it easy. You're exactly what he hoped for. After they hung up, Margaret found Thomas standing at the windows, looking out over the snow-covered estate. We won, she said. We did. Now comes the hard part. Thomas turned to her. Figuring out what to do with $300 million? Figuring out how to be people who deserve it, Margaret corrected. Thomas pulled her close. We'll figure it out together, like we always have. And standing there in the mansion that had waited 40 years for them, Margaret believed him. The morning after the judge's ruling, Margaret woke to find Thomas already dressed and sitting at the desk in their bedroom, a legal pad covered in his handwriting. "What are you doing?" she asked, pulling a robe around her shoulders. "Making a list," he said without looking up, "of people we need to help." Margaret walked over and looked at what he'd written. Names filled the page. Families from their old neighborhood, former students of Margaret's, rangers Thomas had worked with who'd been injured on the job, the woman who used to clean their apartment building and always asked about their health, the teenager who bagged groceries and was saving for community college. "There are at least 50 names here," Margaret said softly. "I know. And these are just the ones I can remember off the top of my head. There are hundreds more, thousands probably, people who work hard and do everything right and still can't get ahead." Margaret sat on the edge of the desk. "Vincent's will says we have to give away at least $27 million a year. So we start there. We help these people first, then we figure out how to help more." It was so simple the way Thomas said it, so straightforward. They had money. Other people needed money, therefore they would give it away. But Margaret knew it wouldn't be that simple. "We need to tell the kids," she said. "Really tell them. No more half-truths." Thomas set down his pen. "I know. They're going to be angry we waited." "Probably. They're going to think we don't trust them." "Maybe we don't," Thomas said quietly. "Or maybe we don't trust ourselves yet. Maybe we needed to know this was real before we could share it." Margaret thought about that. It made sense in a way. For 2 weeks they'd been living in a kind of limbo, not quite believing their situation was permanent. The legal challenge from Harrison had only reinforced that uncertainty, but now it was real, irrevocably real. "I'll call them today," Margaret said. The first call was to David. Margaret asked him to video chat, which immediately made him suspicious. "Mom, what's wrong? Is Dad okay? Are you sick again?" "Everyone's fine," Margaret assured him. "Better than fine. But we need to talk to you about something." David's face on the screen looked worried. Behind him, Margaret could see his apartment, the small kitchen where he probably made instant ramen for dinner more nights than not. Thomas joined Margaret in front of the camera. They'd decided to do this together. "Son," Thomas began, "we haven't been completely honest with you about our situation." "I knew it," David said. "That cabin was dangerous, wasn't it? You should have let me help The cabin was fine," Margaret interrupted, "but we're not there anymore." She turned the phone slowly, panning across the study, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the ornate ceiling, the massive windows overlooking the estate. David's mouth fell open. "Where are you?" "It's a long story," Thomas said. They told him everything. The desperate rental, the blizzard, the discovery of the mansion, Vincent Harlow's tests, the inheritance. David's expression cycled through disbelief, shock, confusion, and finally something that looked like anger. "You've had access to millions of dollars for weeks, and you didn't tell me." His voice was tight. "I've been worried sick about you freezing to death in some cabin, and you've been living in a mansion." "We didn't know if it was real," Margaret said. "There was a legal challenge. We could have lost everything. We didn't want to worry you." "You didn't want to worry me?" David's laugh was bitter. "Mum, I'm working 60-hour weeks because I'm drowning in debt. Sarah's been rationing her kids' insulin because insurance won't cover what they need. James is on antidepressants because his job is killing him. And you didn't think we should know that our parents just inherited $300 million? The words hit like physical blows. Margaret hadn't known about Sarah's kids, hadn't known about James's depression. She'd been so focused on not being a burden that she'd stopped asking about their burdens. "You're right," she said quietly. "We should have told you sooner. We were wrong." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so much like his father it made Margaret's chest ache. "I don't even know what to say. This is insane. This doesn't happen to real people." "It happened to us," Thomas said, "and now we have to figure out what to do with it." "What do you mean, figure out?" David asked. "You're set for life. You can retire comfortably, travel, do whatever you want." "Vincent's will requires us to give away at least 10% annually," Margaret explained. "But more than that, we want to help people like you kids, people who are working themselves to death and still barely surviving." David was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Does this mean you're going to pay off my mortgage?" "Yes," Margaret said, "and your student loans, and set up college funds for your future kids if you have them, and whatever else you need." She watched her son's face crumble. He put his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. When he looked up again, tears streamed down his face. "I don't know whether to be grateful or furious," he admitted. "I've been so stressed, so tired, and you could have fixed it weeks ago." "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "We were scared. We didn't know how to handle this." "None of us know how to handle this," David said. "But we're family. We're supposed to figure it out together." The calls with Sarah and James went similarly. Shock, anger, tears, and finally, cautious hope. By the end of the day, Margaret felt emotionally wrung out, but lighter. The secret had been pressing on her chest like a weight, and now it was lifted. That night, she and Thomas sat in the library, a fire crackling in the fireplace. Thornton had sent over more documents, plans for setting up charitable foundations and family trusts. "David was right," Margaret said. "We should have told them sooner." "We did what we thought was right at the time," Thomas replied. "That's all anyone can do." "Was it right, though, or were we just scared?" Thomas set down the document he'd been reading. "Both, probably. But here's what I know. We spent our whole lives putting our kids first, working extra jobs, going without, making sure they had opportunities we never did. And when we finally got something for ourselves, our first instinct was still to protect them. From disappointment if this fell through, from expectations, from the pressure of sudden wealth. Maybe that was wrong, but it came from love." Margaret leaned against his shoulder. "Vincent never had kids. Never had this kind of complication." "No, but he understood that wealth complicates everything. That's why he was so careful about who he gave it to. He wanted people who understood struggle, who wouldn't take it for granted." "Do you think we'll take it for granted?" Margaret asked. "Eventually, when the shock wears off and this just becomes normal." Thomas considered this. "I think that's up to us. We can let this change us into different people, or we can use it to become more of who we already are." Margaret thought about the list Thomas had made that morning. 50 names of people who needed help, 50 opportunities to make a difference. "I want to start with Sarah's kids," she said. "Get them the insulin they need, the best diabetes care available. They're 7 and 9 years old. They shouldn't have to ration medicine." Thomas nodded. "Done. What else?" "James needs to quit that job that's destroying him. Give him enough money that he can take time off, figure out what he actually wants to do with his life." "Done." "And David. David needs to know he doesn't have to work himself to death anymore." "Also done." Margaret smiled. "This is strange, isn't it? Being able to just solve problems with money?" "It's a privilege," Thomas said, "and a responsibility. Money can solve some problems, but not all of them. We can't buy Sarah more time with her kids, can't purchase happiness for James, can't give David purpose, but we can remove the financial stress so they have space to find those things themselves." Over the following weeks, Margaret and Thomas began to understand the full scope of what they'd inherited. It wasn't just money, it was power, influence, the ability to change lives with a phone call or a signature. It was terrifying. They started small, paid off their children's debts, set up trust funds for their grandchildren, made sure their kids could quit jobs they hated or reduce their hours or go back to school if they wanted. Then they expanded outward. Thomas's list of 50 names grew to 200, then 500. Margaret started researching non-profits, charities, organizations doing good work with limited resources. They discovered that giving away money was harder than they'd thought. Everyone had ideas about what they should do with it: invest in startups, fund political campaigns, build monuments with their names on them. But none of that felt right. "Vincent didn't build this place for ego," Margaret said one evening as they sorted through yet another stack of funding proposals. "He built it to help people, quietly, without fanfare." "So we do the same," Thomas agreed. They created the Harlow Foundation, named after Vincent, not themselves. Its mission was simple: help people who'd fallen through the cracks. People like they'd been, hard-working, responsible, brought down by circumstances beyond their control. The first grants went to families facing medical bankruptcy. Margaret remembered those bills, the weight of them, the hopelessness. Within 3 months, the foundation had paid off medical debt for 200 families. The thank you letters made Margaret cry. Thomas focused on veterans and first responders, people who dedicated their lives to service and been cast aside when they were no longer useful. He funded job training programs, housing assistance, mental health services. But the project closest to their hearts was the estate itself. One night, reading through Vincent's journals again, Margaret found an entry that stopped her cold. May 2nd, 1981. "I've created this paradise, but I'm the only one who lives in it. What good is sustainability if it only sustains one person? What's the point of abundance if it's not shared? I want this place to be full of life, full of people, full of purpose." Margaret showed it to Thomas. He wanted to share this place, but he couldn't figure out how to do it without attracting the wrong people, Thomas said. People who'd exploit it. "But we can," Margaret said slowly. "We can bring people here, people who need it, people like us." The idea took shape over the next few weeks. They would convert parts of the estate into a refuge, not a nursing home or assisted living facility. Those places felt institutional, cold. This would be different. A community, a home. They started renovations on the mansion's east wing. 12 bedrooms, each with private bathrooms, converted into comfortable apartments. Shared common spaces, a library, a dining room, a sunroom overlooking the gardens. Everything accessible, everything designed for dignity. The first residents arrived in April, 6 months after Margaret and Thomas had broken into the house to survive the blizzard. There was Helen, 78, evicted from her apartment after her pension fund collapsed. Robert, 81, a widower who'd been living in his car because Social Security didn't cover rent anywhere in the state. Maria, 73, whose medical bills had forced her to choose between food and prescriptions. Margaret greeted each one personally, showed them to their rooms, assured them this wasn't temporary charity, but a real home. "How long can we stay?" Helen asked, her voice trembling. "As long as you need," Margaret said. "This place was built to last. Might as well fill it with people worth lasting for." Watching the residents settle in, Margaret felt something shift inside her. This was right. This was what Vincent had wanted. Not a monument to his genius, but a living legacy that served others. Thomas started teaching classes in the estate's workshop. Basic carpentry, engine repair, wilderness survival skills he'd learned as a ranger. Some residents participated. Others just enjoyed watching, being part of something. Margaret organized the library, created a reading group, taught piano lessons to Robert's visiting grandchildren. The music room filled with sound again, with life. The gardens expanded. Thomas worked with the residents who were able, teaching them the automated systems, showing them how to grow food sustainably. They harvested vegetables together, shared meals made from their own labor, It wasn't charity, it was community. By summer, all 12 apartments were occupied. The waiting list had 30 names. Margaret and Thomas began planning an expansion, another wing of the mansion they hadn't touched yet. But it wasn't just the estate that transformed. The whole region began to change. Word spread about the strange mansion in the mountains where two elderly people were giving away millions of dollars. Reporters came calling. Margaret and Thomas gave occasional interviews, always redirecting attention from themselves to Vincent's vision. "We're just caretakers," Thomas told a journalist from the New York Times. "Vincent Harlow is the genius. We're just trying to honor what he built." But people saw them differently, saw what they'd done with sudden wealth. Instead of hoarding it, they'd shared it. Instead of building walls, they'd opened doors. Donations started coming in. Not to the foundation, they didn't need more money, but to other organizations, inspired by their example. Letters arrived from people who'd paid off a neighbor's medical bill or funded a stranger's education, citing Margaret and Thomas as inspiration. "We started something," Margaret said one evening, reading through the latest batch of letters. "Vincent started it," Thomas corrected. "We just proved it could work." The hardest part was learning to accept help. Margaret and Thomas had spent their entire lives being self-sufficient, solving their own problems, refusing to burden others. But running an estate and a foundation required more than two people could manage. They hired staff, not servants. They both hated that idea, but partners, people who believed in the mission. Patricia, the financial advisor, came on full-time. Chen, the forensic accountant who'd exposed Harrison, managed the foundation's grants. They brought on caregivers for residents who needed medical support, a chef who created communal meals, maintenance workers to keep the vast estate running. And they learned to delegate, to trust, to admit they didn't have all the answers. "This is harder than I thought," Margaret admitted one night, "being responsible for all these people, all these lives." Vincent felt the same way, Thomas said. He'd become the unofficial keeper of Vincent's journals, could quote passages from memory. Listen to this. August 3, 1979. "Wealth is a burden I never asked for. But burden or blessing, it's mine to bear. The question is whether I bear it alone or share the weight with others." "He shared it with us," Margaret said, "and we're sharing it with everyone else. That's how it works. That's how it's supposed to work." On a cold October morning, 1 year after they'd first arrived at the estate, Margaret stood on the front steps of the mansion and looked out over land that was somehow impossibly theirs. The gardens were harvested for the season, ready for winter. Smoke curled from chimneys as residents woke to another day of warmth and safety. In the distance, she could see the small caretaker's cabin where this had all begun, preserved now as a reminder of where they'd come from. Thomas came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "Thinking about last year?" he asked. "Thinking about how lost we were, how scared. We thought we were just trying to survive the winter." "We were," Thomas said. "We just didn't know what we were surviving for." Footsteps on the porch announced Robert's arrival, coffee mug in hand. He'd become an early riser since moving in, liked to watch the sunrise from the porch swing. "Morning," he said, settling into his spot. "Going to be a cold one." "Good thing we're not in that cabin anymore," Thomas said with a smile. Robert laughed. "Good thing I'm not in my car. Still can't believe this place is real sometimes. Wake up thinking I'm going to be back on the street." "You're not," Margaret said firmly. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Later that day, the foundation held its quarterly meeting. They gathered in the dining room. Margaret, Thomas, Patricia, Chen, and representatives from the various programs they funded. The numbers were staggering. In 12 months, they'd given away $32 million, paid off medical debt for 800 families, funded scholarships for 200 students, provided housing assistance to 400 veterans, supported dozens of nonprofits doing work they believed in, and they were just getting started. The waiting list for estate residency is up to 70 names, Patricia reported. We need to make a decision about expansion. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. They'd discussed this privately but hadn't committed. Vincent's original plans included developing the West Wing, Thomas said. It's essentially empty right now. We could create another 20 apartments without compromising the structure. That's a significant construction project, Chen warned. Expensive, time-consuming, disruptive to current residents. But necessary, Margaret said. If we have the space and people need it, how can we justify keeping it empty? The vote was unanimous. They would expand. As the meeting wrapped up, Patricia pulled Margaret aside. I have something for you, she said, handing over a folder. Just came through today. Margaret opened it and felt her breath catch. It was a letter from the governor, officially recognizing the Harlow Foundation's work and proposing a partnership to expand their model statewide. They want us to help create similar refuges across Montana, Patricia explained. Using our model, our systems, they're offering to match our funding if we'll provide expertise and oversight. Margaret sat down heavily. That's huge. It's Vincent's vision going statewide, potentially nationwide if it works. You and Thomas would be the face of it. We don't want to be the face of anything, Margaret said quickly. This isn't about us. I know, but sometimes the messenger matters as much as the message. People trust you because they see themselves in you. Ordinary people who got an extraordinary chance and chose to share it. That story resonates. Margaret thought about that night a year ago, the choice they'd made to break into the house rather than freeze to death, how one decision, made out of desperation, had led to all of this. Let me talk to Thomas, she said. That evening, she found him in the workshop, helping one of the residents repair a broken chair. His hands moved with practiced ease, showing the man where to apply glue, how to clamp it properly. She waited until they were finished, until the resident had taken his repaired chair and left them alone. The governor wants to expand the program, she said without preamble, statewide, with us as the model. Thomas set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. What did you tell them? That I needed to talk to you first. They stood in the quiet workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and wood glue, and considered what this meant. More people helped, more lives changed, but also more visibility, more responsibility, more of their private lives becoming public. What would Vincent want? Thomas asked. Margaret pulled out the folder she'd been carrying, Vincent's final journal. She'd read it so many times she had it memorized, but she turned to the last entry anyway. December 28th, 1983. My final words for whoever finds this. I've built something that can last, that can help people, but only if someone has the courage to actually use it. Not to hide it away or hoard it or keep it pristine and untouched, but to open it up, let it get messy, let it serve its purpose. Systems are only valuable if they're used. Wealth is only meaningful if it's shared. Legacy is only real if it outlives you. To whoever reads this, be brave enough to share what I've given you. Be bold enough to believe you deserve it, and be generous enough to pass it on. Thomas listened, then nodded slowly. He'd want us to say yes. Even though it scares us? Especially because it scares us. Margaret folded the journal closed. Then we say yes. The expansion happened faster than anyone expected. By the following spring, construction on the West Wing was complete. 20 new apartments, each one filled within a month. The estate that had sat empty for 40 years now housed 32 residents, plus Margaret and Thomas, plus the live-in staff who kept everything running. And it worked. There were challenges, of course. Personalities clashed. Systems broke down. But the community they'd built was resilient. Residents helped each other, supported each other, created a culture of mutual aid that money couldn't buy. Margaret watched Robert teach Helen how to use the estate's computer system. saw Maria mentoring a new resident through the difficulty of accepting help, witnessed Thomas and a group of residents build raised garden beds accessible for wheelchairs. This was what Vincent had wanted, not just sustainability of systems, but sustainability of community, people taking care of each other. The statewide expansion launched in June, 3 new sites across Montana, each modeled on the Harlow estate. Margaret and Thomas traveled to each one, meeting residents, training staff, sharing what they'd learned. It was exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying. But it was right. But success brought unexpected complications. One evening in late July, Margaret received a call from Sarah. Her daughter's voice was strained, barely holding back tears. "Mum, I need to talk to you about something. It's about the kids." Margaret's heart lurched. "Are they okay? Is it their diabetes?" "No, they're healthy, thanks to you. That's actually the problem." Sarah paused. "Their classmates know about the money, about what you and Dad inherited, and now they're being treated differently." Margaret sat down slowly. "Differently how?" "Kids are asking them for money. Parents are suddenly interested in playdates they never cared about before. One teacher made a comment about how they must not need the free lunch program anymore, embarrassed Emma in front of the whole cafeteria." Sarah's voice cracked. "They came home crying today, said they wished we were poor again because at least people were real with them." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on solving problems with money, she hadn't considered how that money might create new problems. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't think—" "None of us thought about this," Sarah interrupted. "How do you prepare kids for suddenly being rich? How do you explain that their grandmother inherited a fortune while their friends' families are still struggling?" Thomas had walked into the room during the conversation. Margaret put the call on speaker. "Sarah," Thomas said gently, "bring the kids here, this weekend. Let them see what we're actually doing with the money. Let them meet the residents, understand the foundation's work. They need to see that wealth is a tool, not an identity." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You think that'll help?" "I think they need to understand where the money came from and what it's for," Thomas replied. "Vincent didn't leave this to us so we could be comfortable. He left it so we could make life more comfortable for others. Your kids need to learn that lesson early." That weekend, Sarah arrived with Emma and Ryan. The children, 9 and 11, were quiet in the car, uncertain, but the moment they saw the estate, their eyes went wide. "Grandma, you live in a castle?" Emma breathed. Margaret knelt down to their level. "I live in a house that was built to help people. Want to see?" She took them on a tour, but not of the grand rooms or expensive artwork. Instead, she introduced them to the residents. Robert showed Ryan his woodworking projects. Helen taught Emma how to play chess in the library. Maria let them help harvest vegetables from the greenhouse. At dinner that night, the entire community gathered. Residents shared their stories, not the tragic parts, but the moments of joy they'd found here. The friendships formed, the skills learned, the feeling of home after years without one. Emma raised her hand like she was in school. "Why do you let all these people live here?" Margaret smiled. "Because your grandfather and I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. We got very lucky, and Vincent Harlow believed that lucky people should help unlucky people, so that's what we're doing." "But it's your house," Ryan said. "You could keep it just for you." "We could," Thomas agreed. "But then we'd be the only 2 people enjoying it. Doesn't it seem better to share it with 32 people who need it?" The children considered this. Later that night, Margaret found Emma sitting on the porch swing with Robert, asking him about his life before the estate. "I was scared all the time," Robert was saying, "living in my car, not knowing where my next meal would come from. But your grandparents gave me a home. Not just a room, but a real home, with people who care." Emma looked up at Margaret, who'd been listening from the doorway. "Is that what the money is for? To make people not scared?" Margaret's throat tightened. Yes, sweetie, that's exactly what it's for. When Sarah and the kids left on Sunday, Emma hugged Margaret tight. I understand now, she whispered. We're not rich because we get to buy stuff. We're rich because we get to help people. After they drove away, Margaret turned to Thomas with tears in her eyes. That was Vincent's final test. What do you mean? He didn't just want to find people who could survive hardship. He wanted to find people who would teach the next generation to use wealth responsibly, to see it as a responsibility, not a reward. Thomas pulled her close. Then we passed. The incident with Sarah's children changed how Margaret and Thomas approached their work. They started bringing their grandchildren to the estate more often, involving them in foundation activities appropriate for their ages. The children helped pack care packages for families in need, wrote cards to scholarship recipients, learned to garden alongside residents. And slowly, Margaret saw the lesson taking root. Her grandchildren stopped seeing the money as something that made them special and started seeing it as something that gave them responsibility. It wasn't easy. There were still awkward questions at school, still people who treated them differently. But the children had a foundation now, an understanding of why their family had wealth and what it was meant to do. On a warm evening in late July, 2 years after that desperate choice to rent a cabin for $300 a month, Margaret stood in the music room and played Beethoven for a room full of people. Residents from the estate, staff members, visitors from the new sites, her own children and grandchildren. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. But Margaret wasn't thinking about the performance. She was thinking about the first time she'd sat at this piano, terrified to touch the keys, convinced she didn't deserve to be there. Now she played without fear, without apology, because somewhere along the way she'd stopped asking whether she deserved this and started asking what she could do with it. Thomas joined her at the piano bench. You know what today is? Thursday? 2 years ago today we signed the lease on the cabin, paid our first $300. Margaret laughed. Best investment we ever made. Second best, Thomas corrected. Best investment was 48 years ago when I asked you to marry me. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Around them, the party continued. Their daughter Sarah played with her children, who no longer had to ration insulin. Their son David laughed with his wife, free from the crushing debt that had consumed him. Their son James had brought his new girlfriend, met after he'd quit his soul-crushing job and found work he actually loved, and scattered throughout the room were the people they'd helped. The families freed from medical debt, the students attending college on Harlow Foundation scholarships, the residents who'd found home when they thought they'd run out of options. Vincent never got to see this, Margaret said quietly. Never got to know his plan worked. I think he knew, Thomas replied. That's why he did it. Not because he'd be here to see it, but because he believed in people. Believed that if you gave the right people the right resources, they'd do good things. Margaret thought about Vincent Harlow, dying alone in a hospital bed, spending his final days programming systems and writing instructions for strangers he'd never meet. It was the loneliest kind of hope. The kind that required faith in humanity without proof. But he'd been right, and somehow, impossibly, his faith had landed on 2 desperate, frightened elderly people who'd been evicted from their apartment and had nowhere else to go. We should tell the story more, Margaret said. The real story, not just the inheritance, but why Vincent did this, what he believed, the systems he built. You want to write a book? Thomas asked, surprised. Maybe. Or start a podcast, or give talks, something that spreads the message. Because it's not about us, and it's not even really about the money. It's about the idea that we can build systems that help people instead of exploiting them, that we can choose generosity over greed, that wealth can be a tool for good if we're brave enough to use it that way. Thomas kissed her forehead. When did you get so wise? When we had nothing left to lose and discovered we had everything to gain. 6 months later, Margaret published her memoir. The $300 Inheritance became a surprise bestseller, not because of the rags to riches story, but because of what Margaret and Thomas chose to do with their riches. The book tour took them across the country. They met people who'd been inspired to start their own foundations, to help their communities, to share what they had instead of hoarding it. "You started a movement," a reporter told Margaret during an interview in Chicago. "Vincent started it," Margaret corrected, as she always did. "We just proved it could work. But anyone can do this. You don't need $300 million to help people. You just need to care enough to try." By their third year on the estate, the Harlow Foundation had expanded beyond Montana. They'd partnered with organizations in 12 states, helping replicate their model. The estate itself had become a training center where staff from new sites could learn the systems, understand the philosophy, see community care in action. And through it all, Margaret and Thomas remained grounded in the small moments. Morning coffee on the porch, tending the gardens, reading to Robert when his eyes got too tired, teaching Maria's great-granddaughter to play piano. They'd learned that wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched. That legacy wasn't about buildings with your name on them, but about systems that outlived you. That the greatest privilege wasn't having everything you needed, but being able to help others get what they needed. On a snowy December evening, almost 3 years to the day after they'd first broken into the mansion, Margaret found Thomas in Vincent's study. He sat at the desk where Vincent had written his final words, updating the estate's operational logs. "I was thinking," Thomas said without looking up, "we should start planning for what happens after we're gone." Margaret's stomach clenched. "That's morbid. It's practical. We're 75 and 78. We won't be here forever. And this place, this mission, it needs to continue without us." He was right, of course. Margaret sat down across from him. "What did you have in mind?" "A board of directors drawn from residents, past and present. Staff members who've been here from the beginning. Our kids, if they want to be involved. People who understand the mission and will protect it after we're gone." Margaret nodded slowly. Vincent spent so much time planning for people he'd never meet. Now we get to do the same. "It's a privilege," Thomas said. "Getting to ensure this continues. Most people don't get that chance." They spent the next several months putting systems in place. Trusts and bylaws and succession plans, boring, necessary work that would protect everything they'd built. And one spring morning, standing in the garden as new shoots pushed through warming soil, Margaret realized something profound. They weren't scared anymore. For so long, fear had been their constant companion. Fear of poverty, of homelessness, of being a burden, of not mattering. But somewhere in the chaos of the past 3 years, that fear had transformed into something else. Purpose. They mattered because they made others matter. They had value because they created value for those around them. They were secure because they'd built community instead of walls. "We did it," she said to Thomas that evening as they sat in their favorite spot on the porch. "We actually did what Vincent wanted." Thomas took her hand. "We're still doing it. This isn't finished." "No," Margaret agreed, "but we proved it's possible. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're given the chance. That's what Vincent believed, and we proved him right." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. Somewhere inside, residents were gathering for dinner, sharing stories, supporting each other. The house that had waited 40 years for the right people was finally completely alive. And Margaret understood now why Vincent had gone to such elaborate lengths. Why the tests? Why the waiting? Why the faith in strangers? Because some things are too important to leave to chance. Some legacies are too valuable to give to just anyone. Sometimes you have to trust that the universe will send exactly the right people at exactly the right time, and somehow, impossibly, the universe had sent them. Two desperate elderly people with nowhere else to go had become the guardians of a $300 million legacy. And instead of being crushed by the weight of it, they'd learned to share it, to spread it, to multiply it through generosity. They'd taken Vincent Harlow's final gift and turned it into something he could never have imagined. Not a monument to one man's genius, but a living, breathing community that proved what was possible when people chose compassion over greed. 5 years after that first desperate winter, Margaret stood in the same spot where she'd first seen the mansion through the trees. But now she wasn't looking at a mysterious, abandoned building. She was looking at home. The estate had grown beyond anything she and Thomas had imagined. 48 residents now lived in the expanded wings. The Harlow Foundation operated in 18 states. Thousands of families had been helped, and the model they'd created was being studied by governments and non-profits worldwide. But the numbers didn't matter as much as the moments. The way Helen had learned to use email and now video called her daughter every Sunday. How Robert had taught woodworking to 23 people, giving them both a skill and a sense of purpose. The scholarship recipients who wrote letters describing how education had transformed their lives and her own family. Watching her grandchildren grow up understanding that privilege came with responsibility. Seeing her children find balance and purpose now that financial stress no longer consumed them. Thomas walked up behind her, his steps slower now but still steady. They were both getting older. Margaret was 77, Thomas 80. They had good days and harder days, but they had each other and they had purpose. Patricia wants to talk about the new site in Oregon, Thomas said. They found a property similar to this one, abandoned estate, perfect for conversion. Margaret smiled. Vincent's model spreading again. It works, Thomas said simply. People just needed to see it could be done. That evening, as had become tradition, the entire estate community gathered for dinner. It was someone's birthday. Margaret had lost track of whose, and there was cake and singing and laughter that filled the grand dining room. Looking around the table, Margaret saw the full spectrum of human experience. People who'd lost everything and found it again. People who'd been forgotten and were now seen. People who'd given up hope and rediscovered it in community. This was Vincent's true genius. Not the sustainable systems or the accumulated wealth, but the understanding that people needed each other. That the strongest structure you could build wasn't made of stone or steel, but of connection, support, and shared purpose. After dinner, Margaret and Thomas walked through the quiet halls of the mansion. 5 years of memories lived in these walls now. Birthdays and holidays, victories and losses, ordinary moments that had become extraordinary because they were shared. They ended up in the study, as they often did. Vincent's journals lined the shelves, his vision preserved in handwritten pages. Thomas had read them all multiple times, could quote entire passages. But tonight he pulled out a different book, the one they'd started keeping themselves. The Harlow Estate Chronicles, he read from the cover, Volume 1. Inside were their own entries, notes about residents, foundation decisions, lessons learned, small victories and hard-earned wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of what it took to turn wealth into well-being. We should leave this for whoever comes after us, Margaret said, the way Vincent left his journals for us. We already are, Thomas replied. Every policy we write, every system we document, every story we tell, we're leaving a roadmap. Margaret thought about the people who would inherit this work someday. Would they be scared like she and Thomas had been? Would they question whether they deserved it? Would they rise to the challenge or be crushed by it? She hoped they'd be ordinary people, people who'd struggled and survived, people who understood loss and therefore understood the value of what they'd been given, people like they'd been. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to accept an unexpected gift and generous enough to share it. As the stars emerged overhead and lights glowed warm in every window of the mansion, Margaret and Thomas didn't reach for wealth or comfort. They reached for each other, for the community they'd built, and for the future they were creating for people they'd never meet. Because they'd learned the most valuable lesson Vincent Harlow had to teach: that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. That true wealth is measured in lives changed, communities strengthened, and hope restored. The elderly couple who'd arrived with nothing but medical debt and broken dreams had become the stewards of something extraordinary, not because they were special or deserving, but because when given the choice between desperation and dignity, between hoarding and helping, between fear and faith, they'd chosen to believe in something bigger than themselves. And that choice had changed everything. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering what's possible when hope meets opportunity. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the people who have nothing are exactly the ones who know what to do with everything.